everyone hear me? Good morning, everyone. Welcome, and thank you very much, Luis Felipe, for inviting me to present this. I've been fascinated by Latin America for 20 years now. I'm a bit of a wanderer. I love traveling around the world, but it's Latin America that brings me back again and again, and I've remained addicted to working on Latin America, thinking about its issues. And for the past 12 years, I've been working for the Economist intelligence unit, first as an analyst, working on country analysis and forecasting for various economies in Latin America. And over the past 6 years, I've been director of the whole team of Latin America analysts. We have 11 people full-time looking at Latin America and working with a network of dozens of contributors in the Latin America region. So when I was asked to, given the date for this, my heart sank, because it's actually terrible timing for me, because I'm in the middle of a move from London to New York, where I'm going to be editorial director for the Americas. And so I flew here yesterday, and I'm flying back tomorrow, and on Wednesday the movers come to move my stuff. But I thought, this is such a fascinating event, and I think it's something that it is. We are in an incredibly interesting moment for Brazil at the moment, because as we know, it's been a country that for decades, it was actually an Austrian author, Stefan Zweig, who coined the term in the 1940s of Brazil being the eternal country of the future. And it's become a bit of a running joke among economists in previous decades that it was always the country of the future, never the country of the present. Well, in my country, in the UK, one of my frustrations being based in London as a Latin Americanist is that even the quality press, the broadsheets, you almost never get any news on Latin America unless it's some quirky thing that shows something strange or amusing or funny. But now we're getting to the point where there is a lot of coverage of Brazil, not Latin America generally, so much so that our most prestigious and serious daily news program, which is a television program called Newsnight that runs late every weekday evening, last week they had a feature, and this very rarely happens on Latin America. They had a feature on how fabulously well Brazil was doing, talking about the growth of the middle class, talking about how now that everyone talks about the BICs rather than the BRICs, because Russia has been elbowed out of late, how Brazil is an interesting case in that although it's smaller than India, the view is that it's doing a better job of tackling poverty and growing the middle class. Thank you. Okay. So, what have I done wrong? So I think there's a lot of euphoria around about compared to what happens at our conferences. When we did our first event in Brazil 2 years ago, or rather we came back to Brazil 2 years ago. So yes, I think it's great that Brazil is very much in the headlines, but I do feel, when I was here last November for the Economist conference in Sao Paulo, gosh, my voice sounds really echoey. I hope that's okay for you, but do say. What struck me there was the tangible euphoria in Brazil about how well it had emerged from the worst global downturn in the past century, since the 1930s. And there, the presentation I gave was very much looking at Brazil in a wider context, and I hope to touch on some of those things here. Because while it's fabulous that Brazil is, the future does seem to have arrived at last for Brazil, I do think that some of the euphoria and complacency is misplaced. I think there's no doubt that Brazil has some fantastic strengths that will position it to be one of the leading economies in the world. But I actually am quite worried about the pace, or rather lack of pace, of movement on some of the fundamental issues that needed to have been addressed over the past 20 years, and we're still there now. So what I'm going to try and do is, hopefully you've all received the papers that we wrote. There's 3 papers looking at political, institutional, and structural economic growth factors, where we wanted to look at what are the practical things that could be addressed now to be thinking about Brazil's future. And this audience is more than familiar with what Brazil's key challenges are, what have been the reforms that we've been trying to push through over the past decade, 2 decades, that are still on the table. So I'm not going to spend too much time looking at those in detail, because I think you're all familiar with them, but more to look at why the urgency. Everyone seems to think Brazil's doing so fabulously well, so what is there to worry about? So with this presentation, I just want to bring out some of the main points in the papers. And I don't want, so therefore I won't have a weary rehearsal of, the familiar ground about second generation reforms and what needs to be done to push them through. More thinking about why the next government really needs to be a hyperactive government. I think also one of the things that why Brazil is so well regarded at the moment is you only have to look at how ugly so many other countries look at the moment, and so it's not that difficult to look beautiful. Obviously, in the developed world, now when you look at Brazil's debt level, it used to be something that Brazil was criticized for. Its public debt was very high. Well, that's nothing compared to what's going on in the OECD. But really what Brazil needs to be doing is learning from the fiscal woes in the developed world, because we know that the OECD faces a protracted period of working out its debt overhang. And that I'm talking about the debt overhang of the collapse of the housing markets and the banking sectors. Forget the fact that they're also facing aging societies. The cost of aging in the developed world in terms of pensions and healthcare is going to dwarf what we've just seen over the past couple of years. So really, Brazil needs to be thinking well ahead in the sense that what we're doing now is going to determine Brazil's growth rate in 20, 25 years' time. So I think one of my points running through this is that there is really a great urgency for politicians in Brazil to be thinking about consciousness raising for some of these difficult reforms that haven't pushed ahead precisely because they are politically difficult. And in the past 5 years, Brazil's had these great growth rates, 2004, 2008, growth average 5% a year. Great, but not that great if you compare it to what was going on in Asia, and not that great if you compare it to the low base of comparison. In a sense, what Brazil did was it restored lost ground. One interesting graph to look at is if you look at real GDP per head, in real terms, measure it at PPP, and compare it to GDP per head in the US. Brazil's about 23% of US real GDP per head. The interesting thing with that graph is if you compare Brazil, China, India, and Mexico over the past 20 years. Of course, with China, you have a soaring line as it catches up towards the developed world. It's still much lower than Brazil. India, you have a less soaring line, but nonetheless a climb. Mexico and Brazil have flatlined for 20 years. So 20 years ago, Brazil's GDP, real GDP, was about 23% of the US. It's now, with the growth of the past 5 years, 24% of the US. So we really need to put in context how fantastic the last 5 years has been. So I think one of the things I feel has come out of these papers, in terms of the general election presenting an opportunity, actually it's more than that. I would argue that the next administration has to be hyperactive over the next 5 years, because a lot of the things that we're identifying in these papers need action now. And so one concern is, we're just coming from 8 years of a government, the Lula government, that's had this extraordinarily strong mandate and high popularity levels. Is either Dilma or Serra going to have the same kind of mandate?